Yai lai 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 yai lai ya la lai 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 yai lai la lai 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 yai lai 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 yai lai 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 ya la lai 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 yai lai 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 ya la lai 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 lai. Many of you know that I like to start learning sessions with a little nigun, and I am pretty much all done with COVID, except for this little thing you hear in the back of my throat. So who thought it was a good idea for me to start leading a nigun today? But there it is. I gave it a shot. As I look around the room, I know almost everyone. And for those of you joining us virtually, we're glad you're here as well. I wouldn't normally introduce myself in our home, but here it goes. I'm Rabbi J. Tel Rav, and it is such a pleasure to have you here today for the Joan, Bruder, Danoff lecture series, the 3rd annual. I'm not going to say any words about that. That's Daniel's job. But what I am going to say is that the synagogue has traditionally, over history, been known by 3 euphemisms, any one of which would turn the attention of the listener directly to the idea of synagogue. That is Beit Tefillah, Beit Knesset, and Beit Limud, a house of prayer, a house of gathering, and a house of study. All 3 of those endeavors take place within these buildings that we now today call synagogues. And so I was just reflecting, as we're going to be hearing from Mara today, about the nature of Jewish study and how it, with us, has evolved constantly over the path of our people's history. And I was just reflecting on how, let's say 1800 years ago, a group of Jews would have been gathered in the Beit Limud, just like we are, and they would have been having discussions or listening to the discussions of leadership on certain issues, but they would have been such different topics from what we're going to be discussing today. And how delicious, that's just the word that comes to mind. How fabulous that our commitment to learning hasn't waned over our centuries, and that it is kept up with where we find ourselves today. Can you imagine our forebears having a conversation about intersectionality like we're going to be having today? I can't easily imagine that. But here we are, led by this emerging awareness of how complex it is to be a Jewish community, and that's not going to change. It's going to get increasingly complex. So those congregations out there who understand that Judaism has always existed to serve the Jews, not vice versa. It's not us who are here to serve Judaism. And so as we open ourselves up to this evolving tradition, we know that it has to be us who creates the evolution. So a conversation like today, which is going to help us step beyond our own personal ways of having seen things into new, open-hearted ways of seeing the world, is only to serve our highest and best purposes. So I will simply lead us now in a bracha over the opportunity to not learn. We often say this is the blessing for the study of Torah. It's such a limited translation. This is the blessing over being affected by Torah, having the engagement with Torah leave us evolved. And so if you know the blessing, join me. If not, understand, say amen, and understand that every word that begins as soon as I step away are words of learning. And today is about leaving this building changed, different than you walked in. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen.
Amen.
And I hand it over to Daniel Block.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Jay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody who has joined us on Zoom and here in person at Temple Sinai. My name is Daniel Block. As a member of Temple Sinai and an organizer of today's event, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our 2023 Joan Bruder Danoff Lecture. This is the third installment of what will hopefully be many more annual events, which honors longtime Sinai members, Joan and Dr. Stuart Danoff. The purpose of the Danoff Lecture is to enrich, as we just heard, enrich the intellectual life of our community by bringing a distinguished figure in Jewish arts, literature, or culture to come speak with us. And we're in for a treat today. The series was endowed by Joan and Stuart's three children, Will Danoff, Nancy Danoff, and Susie Poneman. Please join me in thanking Joan and her family, who are both in the room and online today. Thank you. Thank you. We'd also like to thank all of the people who made this event possible. They include Sophie LaSala from the Harry Walker Agency, Shelley Wellfeld of Temple Sinai, as well as the members of the organizing committee, Joan Danoff, David Cohen, Nan Gordon, Catherine Magurodi, Marty Newman, Sandy Rosenberg, and Shelley Taylor. So, for those who have joined us on Zoom, we would ask that you now mute your audio and video. At this time, please click the microphone and camera icons in the lower left corner of your Zoom screen. A red slash should appear through those symbols, which indicates that the video feed is off and your audio is muted. So please take a moment to click those icons off. For those of you with us in person, you can please mute your cell phones now. And also there is no recording of this conversation permitted. Thank you very much. So if questions come to mind as the conversation unfolds, please write them down on the index cards you picked up upon entering. They are still there at the entrance to the sanctuary. Members of the organizing committee, Nan and Sandy, can you indicate yourself? There's Nan and Sandy's in the far back. They stand ready to walk these cards up to us, and we look forward to posing your questions to our speaker as the conversation unfolds. Unfortunately, we're unable to take questions over Zoom, and our speaker cannot do so either. So at this time, our tech team will close the Zoom chat to minimize distractions. And with that, let me turn it over to my fellow moderator, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Haken-Fink. I am the co-president of Temple Sinai Sisterhood. I'm also a committee member on the Danoff lecture series. I'm so excited to introduce Mara Gadd. She is an award-winning author, speaker, and independent writer and producer. As a president of Gadd Productions, she oversees the development and production of scripted television series and films. A grateful child of adoption, Mara speaks internationally about her transracial adoption in 1970 and her experiences being Black and Ashkenazi Jewish through the lens of her debut memoir, The Color of Love, a story of a mixed-race Jewish girl, winner of the 2020 Midwest Book Award for autobiography and memoir. Mara holds a BA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MA in Jewish history from Baltimore Hebrew Institution at Townsend University. Deeply committed to expanding and exploring the notion of belonging across multiple spectrums, Mara is a member of Soho House International's inaugural Inclusivity Board and a proud recipient of the 2022 Women of Reform Judaism's Women of Empowerment Award. I first came across Mara Gadd's book, The Color of Love, a story of a mixed-race Jewish girl, when I was making selections and reading recommendations for Sisterhood's book club picks for 2021. This book piqued my interest, knowing a handful of my friends had children who were biracial, and this would be an important topic to read and discuss as we broaden our understanding of Judaism today. Reading Mara's book, I was moved by her story, the perseverance she shows, and the messages she communicates in her memoir. I am so excited that she is speaking with us today. So, Mara, for those in our audience who haven't yet spent time with your memoir, The Color of Love, a story of a mixed race Jewish girl, would you please read for us a passage from the prologue to introduce yourself and your story?
Yes, thank you all so much. Thank you for the lovely and generous introductions. Thank you to the Danoff family for supporting the program. And thank you to everyone who has chosen to spend some time with us this afternoon. As Michelle said, I'm going to read a little bit out of the prologue from my book so that you understand my birth story and how I ended up, I guess, here today. Here meaning not just here from Los Angeles, but here in terms of this larger conversation that we're going to have. So here we go. I was born in April 1970 to a young, unmarried white Jewish girl from Manhattan. When she learned that she was pregnant, she went to her rabbi for help, telling him that she could not keep the baby and that her parents would certainly kill her if her pregnancy were to be found out. And so, as he had done many times before with other girls in her condition, he sent her away from the city upstate to Binghamton so that she could keep her pregnancy hidden. A few years prior, my beloved late cousin Adrienne May and her husband Hal had connected with this same rabbi, despite the fact that they lived in Milwaukee and he was in New York. My cousins were infertile, and this rabbi had made it his mission to make sure that Jewish babies in need of homes were placed with Jewish families. They adopted 2 children through him. Most rabbis have causes that are dear to them, and this cause was his. Meanwhile, my parents had been trying to get pregnant for nearly a year before going to a doctor. And according to the limited fertility testing available in 1969, my father had a low sperm count, and so the doctor suggested my parents use artificial insemination so that the baby would be half theirs. My mother saw the horrified look on my father's face, and without missing a beat, she informed the doctor that they would be adopting. This way, she told him, the baby would be all theirs. My mother called Adrienne called the rabbi, and he called my parents, telling them that he had a girl who was due in April and that they could have her baby. Interestingly, my parents had arranged to adopt a baby prior to being offered me, but the birth mother changed her mind once her baby was born, leaving my parents devastated. It was not through the rabbi who eventually sorted us out, but through a more traditional agency. And I thank God every day that this other woman did change her mind. For I believe with every fiber of my being that my parents didn't get the first baby because they were meant to get me. Infertility is fairly common in the Jewish community. And throughout history, adoption has always been a solution to that issue, even in the 1960s and 70s, when there was still a fair bit of shame and secrecy around it. Couples would go to great lengths to get a child who looked just like them so as to avoid questions. Adrienne and Hal had that luxury. My parents did not. I was born on my father's birthday. My parents were out celebrating and received a message that I had arrived and that they should head to New York and pick me up. So they flew immediately from Chicago to Binghamton and went straight to the hospital. My mother tells me that my adult lifestyle and colorful and at times dramatic personality are not a surprise, given that I was kept in a private nursery surrounded by guards to ensure that I did not end up in the wrong hands. When the attorney arrived to hand me off to my parents, he went into the nursery, he leaned over to look into the crib, and turned in shock to the neonatal nurse. "Are you sure that's the right baby?" "That's the baby," she replied. I was the color of milk chocolate and had a head full of dark, curly hair. He apparently became even paler than usual, his face having drained of all color. Today, there would be a bidding war for a baby who looked like me. But that was not the case in 1970. And while it seems that my biological mother was a young, unwed, and let's say passionate creature, she was also smart and forward-thinking enough to know that it would be unlikely that she would find a family willing to knowingly take a biracial baby. So she did not disclose that her lover had been Black and left the rabbi, his attorney, and my parents to sort it all out. The rabbi apologized to my parents and told them they didn't have to take me. A mistake had been made. A mixed race baby wasn't what they had signed up for. But my parents and I had already fallen in love. Returning me was not an option because to them, no mistake had been made. When they looked into my crib, they didn't see a biracial baby. They simply saw their new daughter. And at 3 days old, I was taken home to Chicago. Unlike most adoptions today, mine was closed. My parents never met my biological mother. My mother did see her through the window of her hospital room, and she has only ever said that she was a bottle blonde young woman. The only thing we know about my biological father is that he was Black. I'm not sure if he was ever even told that I exist. I have never been contacted by the biological relatives who might be out in the world, nor have I ever sought to find them. For while I had to be carried in another woman's womb, my family has always been the one that I was meant to have. I chose them for a reason. And yes, I chose them and not the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm thinking about a moment, just a passage later in your prologue, Mara, when you have the line, Jews are white, Black people aren't Jewish, and yet here I am, a mixed race Jewish unicorn. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what you mean by the word unicorn and what kind of perspectives you bring to the table that other people might not have and that are important for you and your experience.
You know, identity in the way that we discuss it today is not something that we talked about in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, even in the early 2000s. And so as the conversation around identity started to ramp up out in the larger cultural discourse, I understood that I had to come up with ways to participate and to frame my own identity. And so unicorn was one of the words that I chose because unicorns are magical and they're rare. And although diversity, particularly in the Jewish community, is on the rise racially every day at this point, it is not always treated as something that is magical. And I wanted to really lean into the joy and the magic of being all of the things that I am. So I use unicorn in that way. And you know, one of the great gifts, although it doesn't always feel like a gift because sometimes it is very painful, in being a unicorn is that when people sort of decide that you are other, that you are different from them, there's this thing that happens. They let everything drop. Every pretense drops, every, in some cases, sense of decency drops, every filter drops, and people say exactly what they think at all times. And again, often for me, that is profoundly painful. Sometimes it is deeply insulting, sometimes it is anti-Semitic, sometimes it's racist, sometimes it's dangerous, but it has given me an understanding of the power of truth. I have never questioned what people think of me because they will tell me. And in the 21st century, with the advent of social media, they will really tell me. There is this strange thing when, you know, I think what happens with human beings is we meet someone and there's this natural human response. We scan the person across from us to try to figure out all of the ways that we might be alike. Right? So let's say I'm standing across from somebody who is Jewish and they come to understand that I'm Jewish. They start scanning. But if they are white and Jewish, they get to the part where I'm brown and Jewish. And they're like, oh no, we're not aligned here. And in some cases, discomfort kicks in. And when that happens, like I said, all of the truth comes out. And so I really do have this lens into the world that is unfiltered, and it is truth, whether it is beautiful truth, like the kind of unconditional love that my parents showed me from the moment I was born, or the ugly kind of truth. I bathe in it. And I do think that's a gift.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. You know, speaking of truth and the truths that we see on the news and we read about in the media, last month, there were 2 shootings of Jewish men as they were leaving synagogues in Los Angeles's Pico Robertson neighborhood. You live in around Los Angeles. You're streaming to us from this area. So how are you and your community right now? Have you been able to go back to Temple? And what are your specific concerns about attending Shabbat services right now based on current climates?
So there's a lot packed into that question. And so I'm going to sort of take it one thing at a time. For those of you who may not be familiar with Pico Robertson, it is very similar to the Hasidic neighborhoods in Brooklyn, where it is, I mean, it's like you're stepping back in time sometimes, and there are signs in Yiddish, and lots and lots and lots, like a densely held Orthodox Jewish community there. There is this very strange combination of defiance and resignation that exists. I would imagine not just here, but everywhere, with anti-Semitism arguably higher than it has ever been, more violent in ways that it has never been, ever been. There's just this sense of, like with everything else, this is the way that it is. And so people go about their business, and people go to shul, and they go to the store, and they, and Purim, there was celebrating in the streets. And so there is this strange sense that this is just the way it is. And there is something really heartbreaking to me about that, because we should never be resigned to violence. We should not be resigned to anti-Semitism. We should not be resigned to racism. This must not be the way that it is. So the community is, as we all are, in a constant state of reaction and healing and moving on and going about our lives. For me, going to synagogue is a particularly complicated question. I do not belong to a synagogue because I have never been to a synagogue where I have not been marginalized. I'm going to say that again. I have never been to a synagogue in any city in this country where I have not been marginalized. And until I step foot into a synagogue and I am greeted and treated the way that I deserve to be, I will not pay for the privilege of being marginalized in a space where I belong. So I do not belong to a synagogue. I continue to try, which at times is it's scary for me, because when anti-Semitism rises and there are acts of violence, what happens, and rightfully so, is that security increases in Jewish spaces, because it should. And again, to be very clear, I 100% believe that we must have secure buildings. We must be safe in our spaces, and that requires security. However, if security, if greeters, if people are not instructed and trained to understand that people of color must not be assumed to be a threat, what happens very often is that I am assumed to be a threat. And so I've been patted down by security guards. I've had my car searched by security guards. I'm routinely asked, not just by security guards, but by greeters, what are you doing here? So for me, the question of going to synagogue is a very painful one, because I love going to shul. I really do. Like, I love going to shul. And I don't feel safe there among my own people, because my reason for being there is always questioned, and by some, I'm viewed as a threat. So if you will indulge me, I'm going to talk you through what happened when I tried to go to shul a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you.
In Los Angeles, the synagogues are physically enormous spaces. They are many times the size of like community colleges. Really, they house schools, some of them house camps, And so there are these giant campuses, and most of them have gates. And those gates are guarded by security guards. And so I pulled up to the security guard and I rolled down my window, and the security guard looked at me and he said, "Hello." And I said, "Hello." And he stared at me. And I said, "Would you like to see my ID or something?" He said, "Well, what are you doing here?" Now, again, if your experience starts on a Friday night with "what are you doing here?" for me, that's already, strike one. And I said, "Well, I'm here for Shabbat services." And he said, "Well, I wouldn't know that." And I said, "Well, now you do." So I made it past the gate and I went in, and this particular service, the cantor said, the rabbi wasn't there that night, so the cantor was leading the service. The cantor got up and made a big thing about how this is a service about love. We are here to talk about love. So she asked that everybody turn to their neighbors, to their sides, to the front, to the back, and wish the people around you a Shabbat Shalom. And so I did. And I watched the woman in front of me turn to the people around her, all of whom were white, and wish them a good Shabbos. And then she turned around and faced me, and I smiled at her and I said, "Good Shabbos." And I watched her eyes. There's something that happens in the eyes. Her eyes got dark. And without a single word, she turned around and sat down. She would not wish me a good Shabbos. And then services began, and we were praying, and my bubby would use the term shushking, right? That you're whispering, but you're really not whispering because you're saying it loud enough so that people can hear you. And there were two men sitting behind me, shushking about me. My God, she knows all the prayers. Why do you think she knows the prayers? She knows what to do. She knew to turn around and bow when we were singing Lecha Dodi. How do you think she knows the prayers? And I wanted to turn around and say, she knows the prayers because she's Jewish. But I was not going to indulge that. These men were so distracted by the sight of me praying, which is what we were ostensibly there to do, that they were not praying themselves. They were talking about me. This is a very typical experience for me going to synagogue. Every single thing I just described is a very typical experience. And so I will not go back to that shul. I will try again. That's how it is for me. I hope, did I get all the points in the question?
Yes, and thank you for sharing.
So just a follow-up question to that. When you enter a Jewish space, how often do you get some version of "what are you doing here"? Is that every time?
Every time.
Wow.
Unless I am, now I will say, when I was able to be, when I am an honored and invited guest, right? Like when there's posters with my face on it everywhere and I'm there for a speaking engagement, maybe not then, but then I'm also met at the door and I'm escorted in and there's a bit of a fuss made. But if I just show up to go to services like any other Jewish person would do, it's every single time. There is some version of "what are you doing here?" And these are, to be very clear, these are Reform congregations, Reconstructionist congregations, self-described progressive congregations, some of the non-denominational version that we now see popping up, some that are conservative. There is always some version of "what are you doing here?" And there is always some version of the men who were like, "Look at her, she can do it in Hebrew." That they marvel at the fact that I can actually pray and don't understand why that would be the case. So that it happens every time.
So then how do you respond when Jews frame race and racial justice as something that happens outside of the Jewish community?
You know, I'm going to give two answers to that, because for me, there is a before and an after. Before the summer of George Floyd, before I wrote a memoir about exactly this, before, I always simply felt like the most visible but invisible person in every Jewish space. Visible because everybody was always turning and staring and pointing and wondering, but invisible because there was this refrain that, you know, how many times do we talk about Heschel marching with Dr. King, right? That we are in it together, and racial justice and racial equity, and, you know, and all of this happens, and we don't do this in the, we do not do this as Jews. And in the very room where they're saying that, they're doing it to me. But then George Floyd was murdered on video. And everybody saw it, and the whole world stopped. And we began a discussion in the larger cultural discourse and in the Jewish community that I'm deeply grateful that I was an integral part of. I've spoken at 64 places, many of them synagogues, about this very thing. And all the Black Lives Matter, and we're going to do better, and we're going to do different. And we have bounced right back to where we were. If I am still being asked, what are you doing here? We're right back where we started. And then for me, so now I don't feel invisible. Now I am outraged. I am outraged. I am heartbroken. I am depressed by the hypocrisy of it all. In an increasingly diverse Jewish world, there was a 2020 study done that at least 20% of Jewish homes identify as having transracial elements to it. 20% and rising. When I was a kid, I was the only kid, but I am not the only kid now. And we are going to devastate our children, as I have been devastated, as I continue to be devastated, if we continue to say that it exists outside of us. And the ways that I see it manifesting are really something. You know, like synagogues will bring in speakers to talk about racial equity, but they're not bringing in speakers who are both and, who are Black and, Asian and Jewish. They're bringing in speakers who are not Jewish, so that the stories like the ones that I can tell are not being told. It is painful, and it hurts my heart. It hurts my heart. Because we should be better than this. We must be better than this. Why would people, I won't go to a restaurant twice that doesn't treat me well. Why would I stay a part of a community that doesn't treat me well? We stand to lose ourselves and the beauty of ourselves if we don't understand that we are simply not all the same on the outside. And that there's nowhere in Torah that it says that Jews are white. P.S. If somebody can show me the place in Torah where it says that Jews are white, I will give you $1 million. But I promise you it's not there.
So Mara, you have amazing and supportive parents, even decades after your father's passing. What do you think are the 3 key values they impressed upon you and you would want all parents to take away and apply to their own children, piggybacking off of some of the keys that you already shared with us?
I mean, just picking 3 is a tall task, because I picked the greatest parents in the world. And there is not a day that goes by that I don't miss my father he's been gone 33 years, and that I don't thank God for my mother. I would say 1, every child needs safe spaces. Every single child needs safe spaces. And my parents created an immediately safe space for me every single place we were. So within our family, I speak to this in my book. If there were members of the family that could not accept that they had adopted a brown baby, they simply were not welcome in our home. It was very simple. My parents went on to have 2 biological children. So I have a brother and a sister who are biological to my family and white. And if there were family members that treated my siblings differently and better than they treated me, they were not welcome to come back. If we were out in the streets and people, you know, my parents never, I've never been referred to as their adopted daughter. I'm their daughter. My mother would say, these are my children. And, you know, people would give a look and all of them are your children. You know, my parents immediately created that safety around me everywhere I went, whether it was having to stand up for me in public or doing it more quietly. Like when it was time for me to have my bat mitzvah, I came home crying from a few bar and bat mitzvahs because none of the boys would dance with me. At the time, I had a very short afro, and it was the cause of great torture and pain. Some of those boys still to this day, I'm going to be 53 years old, and some of those boys still, if they see me, will bring up my hair from back then. They were not going to dance with the girl with the afro. And so I came home crying. My parents didn't say anything other than words of comfort. And when it came time to plan my bat mitzvah party, they planned one that wouldn't involve dancing, slow dancing, so that I would not be humiliated and marginalized at my own bat mitzvah. And they didn't make a thing out of it. They just created safety for me. And so I would say, one, that being a safe place for your children is such a gift. And not every child does have that. I hear many, many stories from children who don't feel like their parents are their safe place. So that's one. I would say two, my parents, my mother is, my father, they're a masterclass in unconditional love. That love is not transactional. It's not, I will love you if you get straight A's, or I will love you if you will follow in the family business footsteps, or I will love you if you do this or don't do that. It is, I love you. And I love you as you are. I love you not for who I want you to be, but as you are. That is, you know, my brother, my sister, and I are each, my mom and I were just talking about this like yesterday. We are each very different people, very, very different people. And my mother loves each of us exactly as we are. She doesn't want us to be different. She doesn't need us to be different. It isn't to say that we didn't have boundaries and things like that. Unconditional love is not, it doesn't give you license to behave badly. But to give someone the freedom to be all of the things that they are and to say simply, I love you, that's love. And it's beautiful and powerful. And I would say the third thing is that they taught me a sense of accountability for my own behavior from the time that I was very young. That, you know, it was my choice about who I was going to be out in the world and how I was going to behave out in the world. And that I had to be responsible for that and to that. And that how I behave in the world matters. And what they used to say, I may have been a tiny bit of a hellraiser in my teenage years. I may have been, I've heard there are stories, thank God there's no social media to substantiate it. I may have been a bit of a party girl in college. Really, thank God there's no social media from when I was in college, like really. And my mother and father used to say to me, you know, you're out in the world now. And so what we will say to you is this: if you are doing something that you would be so ashamed of that you didn't feel like you could tell us you had done it, maybe you should think twice about that. And it was really, it was this very sort of gentle but sage way of reminding me that I was out in the world and I was free to do as I wished. But at the end of the day, I should consider my behavior. And to this day, I do. And I'm grateful for that, because I think accountability is one of the things sorely lacking in the world today. So those are three things that I chose for today, but there are 3 million things.
Great,
Yes.
great lessons. Yes.
3 million things.
Thank you. I think we're going to start to transition to questions from the audience. So if the audience in the room, unfortunately not on Zoom, but in the room has questions, you can certainly write them down on note cards, and Sandy and Nan, who are circulating, can certainly walk them up to us when they're ready. Here's a question, and then I'll piggyback a question from the audience. I read verbatim. Wouldn't the questioning, what are you doing here, for instance, not take place if you joined a synagogue and people got to know you? This is the question. And just to piggyback on this question a little bit, I'm just wondering about how you care for yourself. When you repeatedly get, what are you doing here? You said you've done 63 of these events. How are you able to do 63 of these events when, as you've told me in a separate conversation, you've been called every awful name in the book at events like these? What do you do to sustain yourself before, during, and after conversations like this one, or when you enter a synagogue space?
So I'm going to take the question from the audience first about this notion of, wouldn't the questioning stop if they got to know me? But at the end of the day, when my white siblings go to a synagogue for the first time, they don't get asked those questions. And so at the heart of those questions is racism. If you don't ask that question of every single person who enters the space, if that were the case, then we wouldn't be having this discussion, right? But it's not the case. I am being asked because I am brown. And so my response to that is, you shouldn't have to get to know me. You should want to get to know me. You should smile at me and say good Shabbos when I say good Shabbos back. I was once, a different version of that question came up and it was a rabbi who said this, no less. Well, maybe people just need to get used to you. You know, like for kids, they have to try what they consider to be a yucky vegetable 13 or 14 times, my pediatrician said. Maybe you're like broccoli to a kid. Maybe they just have to try you a bunch of times to know it's okay. And I lost my mind. I was like, first of all, I'm not a yucky vegetable. I'm a human being. Mm-hmm. Second of all, I am a human being and I am a Jew. I am not separate from anyone else in the community simply because my skin is brown. And I will not allow myself to be held as separate. So it is my hope that people will want to get to know me because I am simply someone they don't know already. But the question, what are you doing here, is never acceptable. And I will not leave space for it to be, if that makes sense. And as for how I do this, you know, there is a very real toll on mental health that racism, that anti-Semitism, that bias, that hate takes on people. A very real toll. And to be very clear, I believe that bias is a human condition, that every single human being, myself included, holds bias of some kind. So I am not someone who thinks that these people hold bias and these people don't. We all hold bias. It is our human condition, and therefore it is our human work to do. But the toll that hate takes is serious. And at a certain point in my 20s, it had taken such a toll on me that I had to decide if I was going to stay in the world. And I considered suicide more than once. because why would I want to stay in a world that doesn't want me, that doesn't believe that I have the right to exist in the form I exist in, that doesn't believe I'm worthy of respect or kindness or love? And so I got help. I started seeing a therapist when I was in my 20s, and I've been in therapy for 30 years. Because I knew that if I was going to stay, and I made the decision that obviously I was going to stay, I didn't want to live a miserable life. I don't believe that God created any of us to be miserable or abused or to feel horrible. I am here to thrive and to be happy and to have a beautiful life. And so therapy is certainly a huge part of that. I have a very big life and I have a very small life, right? Like I have a presence out in the larger world, like doing things like this, but my personal life is teeny tiny. I can count on one hand the number of people that I consider to be friend. In spite of the fact that I wrote a memoir that's really quite, open, I'm actually very private about a lot of things. I don't share personal things on social media. I am a God person. I acknowledge that not everybody believes in God, but I am a God person. I pray, I meditate every single day to ground myself. I don't drink anymore because I knew that, and it was my book tour that taught me that would be a terrible idea, because the minute I saw what was what was happening in the rooms, I was like, well, I can't be the person sitting in my room drinking scotch afterwards. So I stopped drinking. When something hurts, I say so. I do not pretend that it doesn't hurt for a minute. And then I go through the exercise of letting it go, because otherwise I will not survive. If you continue to hold on to all of it, it's like, to me, it's the equivalent of wearing an overcoat that eventually all the stones weigh you down so much that you drown under the pain of it. And so I go through the work to let it go. I know who my safe places are. I know who my people are. And so I live a very intentional, very deliberate, very careful life. And I also know that I'm a Jew. And no one is going to take that from me. And so every day I get up and I start over. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yes.
Thank you.
You want me to?
Great.
So somebody in the audience is asking, can you share a positive experience that you've had with any Jewish community where you felt a sense of belonging, support, and inclusion in the US or in Israel?
What I will say is this: there are individuals all over the world where I feel seen and loved and heard and embraced. But tribally, communally, that is not an experience that I've ever had. In Israel, in Istanbul, I wanted to go to the synagogues in Istanbul, and I read up on how you're supposed to do that, and I got to Istanbul and came with my passport, and the security guards wouldn't let me in because they didn't believe that I was Jewish. Racism exists in Israel, in case anybody is already wondering that. I've been to Israel many, many times. I consider myself to be a Zionist. But wherever there are humans, there is racism. And so there are individuals that have embraced me warmly all over the world. But communally, the minute it starts with, why are you here? For me, that's it's done. So communally, I don't feel, and to be very clear, I am no more warmly embraced by the Black community. This is not simply a Jewish experience for me. The Black community is not wrapping its arms around me either. And I want to be very clear about that, because I think, oftentimes when we're in Jewish spaces, we talk a lot about my Jewish experience, and rightfully so. but I am not tribally embraced by either of the tribes that made me.
So then would it be accurate to say that you strive to create spaces in your personal life where people embrace your whole self instead of just a component of who you are? Is that something that's important to you in continually being confronted with this choice? Be Black, be Jewish, you can't be both. How do you, as needing to compartmentalize your existence, your identity in a way that's damaging, is it your personal life and the small personal world where you look to create that sense of wholeness, or where do you find wholeness? I guess
I am whole every minute of every day. I am whole no matter where I am, no matter who I'm around. I do not compartmentalize any of my identity. Other people do. People talk about how it's challenging and it's complex and it's confusing. It's not for me. People will often, if you are bi or multiracial, they will ask you about your parts, right? You're part Jewish and you're part this. No, I'm all. I don't have a leg that's Jewish and an arm that's Black. I am a whole being at all times. And it, again, that has been an evolution for me to be able to articulate it and to be able to say, I understand that for the outside world, my identity is challenging, but it is not challenging for me. It is beautiful for me. And the people that are a part of my intimate world think it's beautiful too. And so, and the minute people push me about picking a side, right? Like, I can't not be Black. That is not an option. But oftentimes people will point out that I could choose not to be Jewish. And I suppose that they're right. But how can I choose not to be what I am? I am a Jew. I'm a Jew who can curse in Yiddish. I am a Jew. And nobody is going to tell me in what percentage or in what part, or, I just don't allow for it anymore. I used to be afraid to stand up and say, no, you're not allowed to say that to me or about me. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid anymore, because anybody who believes those things, they're not my people anyway. There's somebody, and it has been a painful culling, right? People that I grew up with, people that I went, and I grew up going to a URJ camp in Wisconsin, and I've been to Israel, and I was the president of my youth group at Temple, and I was, the vice president of SIFTI. There was not a more involved Jewish kid than me. All of these people, many of those people are no longer my friends. They are not able to look me in the eye. Somebody I know from camp recently, we were having a conversation. He's the executive director of a very large synagogue in the Chicago area. And he said, Mara, I love you. I'm just sorry that you will never be normal. And I said, I'm sorry, what? And he said, I'm sorry, you're never going to be normal. I mean, there's never going to be enough of you for you to be normal, so it'll never be better than this. And I said, so all these years, for 35 years, you've looked at me and thought she's not normal? This is the reality of what it is to be, deemed other, and to not allow for people to simply be who they are. And I don't understand it. I've never understood it. But when people who claim to love you and have known you your whole life think you're not normal, I mean, there's not a whole lot of space to go from there.
Just one direct follow-up, a question from the audience. I wonder what kind of perspectives you might be able to offer the person who wrote this. I'm reading here, quote, I am a white American Jew. I grew up during World War II in a Hasidic neighborhood in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. My family was ortho-conservative, and I was constantly rejected by the Hasidic community. Just on the theme of supposedly somebody saying somebody else is not normal, can't be normal. And any thoughts for the person who wrote this, coming at the question of identity, perhaps from a political lens?
You know, I think that rejection is also a common human experience. And I speak to it from this place because this is the place from which I experience it. But I also know that it is something every single human being experiences. And so the way that I have come to metabolize that is that those are simply not my places or my people or my community. You know, in the Jewish community, there's this beautiful phrase in Hebrew, Am echad belev echad, one people with one heart. That is what we are supposed to be, right? That is what we're supposed to be. But to the point of the person who sent this question in, we don't treat each other that way on a multitude of levels. On a multitude of levels. And so what I would say is, I am so sorry first that you were treated that way. And I hope that you have been able to find a place where you are embraced. That's the goal, is to go where the love is. And so I guess that's what I would tell anybody, is go where the love is. And if it's not in that neighborhood or at that shul, try again. Go to another one.
And that's just a beautiful like mantra to end on. That I think with the one people and the one heart. I mean, I know that we can stay and talk for a really long time with you and ask you more questions, but I think time-wise and our time commitment, that's a great place to end. Mara, thank you so much for all your insight, all your knowledge, for sharing these experiences that we shake our heads at and think like, how is that possible? When you share the stories, and to hear your stories, that it is possible, that we still have more work to do, more repairing to do, to build that one heart and that one people.
If I could offer an analogy to sort of close on, you know, we now in the aftermath of the George Floyd summer and those protests, we have DEI or DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And somebody pointed out to me the other day that a really healthy approach to belonging, which is really what we're talking about, right, is how do we expand this idea of what it means to belong to the Jewish community? It's like having a healthy body. You don't eat one meal that's healthy and work out one time and think that all of a sudden you're healthy for the rest of your life. You have to have an ongoing, sustained commitment to taking care of your body through the food that you eat, through the exercise that you do, through things that you choose not to do. And I think a commitment to belonging works the same way. It is not about any one book or any one speaker or any one event. It has to be an ongoing commitment to make sure that our tables are indeed getting bigger so that there is a seat for everyone at them, that we are not building separate tents. You know, we talk a lot about the bigger tent, that we're not building separate tents instead of a bigger tent, that we are actually expanding, opening our arms and opening our hearts and not separating ourselves. Because Am echad belev echad is about one, a collective heartbeat. And that is, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of being Jewish.
Friends, could you please join me in thanking Mara Gadd so much?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That concludes the formal portion of the 2023 Danoff Lecture. Please come again. Thank you. Thank you.
Mara, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being such thoughtful partners and for the wonderful questions. I'm very grateful. And I hope to meet you in person one day.
That would be wonderful.
We'll look out for your dates in New York City.
Yes.
My poor friends in New York who couldn't figure out that I wasn't coming. And enjoy, I heard that there are snacks and treats for the people who are in the room. So enjoy the snacks and treats for me.
Yeah, we will. We will. Thank you. I'm very, very grateful for this conversation. Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have
Bye.
a good night.
You too.